Splinter by J.S. Miller. Read by Adam Slate. Chapter 1. Shadows of Skyhold. The wind howled as the sleek silver towers of Skyhold scraped against the darkening sky, their neon lights flickering like fireflies in the mist. Below, in the slums of Sector 12, the air was thick with smog, a mix of dust, heat, and the faint crackle of energy pulsing through the city's vast network of airborne vehicles and towering superstructures. It was a city of the future, but for those living in its lower levels, the future had long since left them behind. Rian Vale navigated the shadowed alleys with the precision of someone who knew these streets all too well. His footsteps were light, his body relaxed but alert. Years of surviving as a courier for hire had honed his instincts, making him wary of every corner, every passerby. You could never tell who was on Concord's payroll down here. He tugged at the collar of his coat, pulling it higher around his neck as he adjusted the bag slung across his shoulder. Inside the bag was his latest delivery, a small, unmarked package. Simple job, they'd told him. Nothing unusual. But Rian knew better. In Skyhold, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The familiar hum of a skimmer, a personal aerial vehicle, whined overhead. Rian instinctively pulled back into the shadows, his dark hair blending into the shadows, his sharp green eyes scanning the street for any sign of trouble. He caught a glimpse of the skimmer as it flew past, its Concord insignia barely visible in the fading light. The Concord, the corporation that ruled everything. From the air you breathed to the lights in your home, they had their hands on it all. Once, Rian had believed in their mission, back when he'd been a soldier, fighting for their cause. But that felt like a lifetime ago. Now he worked for anyone who could pay, ferrying illicit tech, information, and contraband through Skyhold's labyrinthine sectors. The money wasn't great, but it was enough to keep him alive. And these days, survival was the only thing that mattered. He reached his destination, a rundown warehouse nestled between two towering apartment blocks. The entrance was nearly invisible, hidden behind rusting metal beams and flickering holographic ads. Rian knocked 3 times on the metal door, waited, and then knocked once more. The door hissed open, revealing a woman standing in the dimly lit interior. She was tall, with short cropped brown hair and a stern expression. Her eyes flicked to the bag over Rian's shoulder. "You're late," she said, her voice low but sharp. "Traffic," Rian replied dryly, stepping inside and glancing around. The warehouse was mostly empty, save for a few crates stacked against the far wall and a large table in the center covered with tech, some of it recognizable, some of it not. The woman's name was Lila Kaur, though Rian only knew that because of the rumors that circulated in the underworld. She was a top engineer for the Concord, or at least she used to be. Now she operated in the shadows, supplying the city's lower sectors with tech that the Concord didn't want people to have. "Got what you wanted," Rian said, tossing the bag onto the table. Lila opened it with the precision of someone used to handling dangerous materials. She pulled out the small black device inside, a data chip no bigger than a fingernail. Her eyes widened for a moment before she quickly schooled her expression. "This is it?" she asked, her voice suddenly tense. "That's what you asked for, isn't it?" Rian said, raising an eyebrow. Lila hesitated, her fingers brushing over the chip's smooth surface. "Do you have any idea what this is?" "Not my business to know," Rian replied, leaning against the wall. "I'm just the delivery guy." Lila looked at him sharply. "You should care. This isn't just some ordinary piece of tech, Vale. This could change everything." Before Rian could respond, the distant hum of skimmers grew louder, the unmistakable sound of Concord's security forces. His hand instinctively went to the blaster hidden beneath his coat. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low, eyes narrowing at Lila. "I didn't do anything," she hissed, but the tension in her voice told a different story. "We need to go. Now." Rian didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed the bag and followed her toward the back of the warehouse. But just as they reached the exit, the door burst open and a squad of Concord enforcers stormed in, their weapons raised. "Hold it right there!" one of them barked, their visor glinting under the dim light. Ryan's heart pounded as he recognized the man standing at the front of the squad. Ezekiel "Zeke" Hart, Ryan's childhood friend, his former comrade in the military, and now one of Concord's top enforcers. "Zeke," Rian said, disbelief in his voice. "You're leading this?" Zeke's eyes flicked to Rian, a mixture of surprise and anger flashing across his face. "Rian, you're involved in this?" Rian took a step back, his hand tightening around the grip of his blaster. "I didn't know it was you." "I didn't know it was you either, but that doesn't change things," Zeke said, his voice cold. "Step aside. We're here for the tech." Ryan's mind raced. Zeke had always been loyal to the Concord, believing in their mission even when Rian had walked away. They had once fought side by side, but now they stood on opposite sides of a growing chasm. "You don't know what you're doing," Rian said, his voice low. "Whatever the Concord told you, it's a lie." Zeke's jaw tightened. "You're the one who doesn't understand, Rian. The Concord is trying to save this city." "They're trying to control it," Rian snapped, "and you're just a pawn in their game." For a moment Zeke hesitated, his gaze shifting to the chip in Lila's hand. "Give me the chip, Rian. We can end this without anyone getting hurt." Rian shook his head. "I can't do that." Zeke's expression hardened. "Then you leave me no choice." In an instant, the warehouse exploded into chaos. Blaster fire echoed through the air as Rian ducked behind a crate, returning fire while Lila scrambled to find cover. The Concord enforcers moved with military precision, closing in on them from all sides. "Rian!" Lila shouted from behind a stack of crates. "We need to get out of here!" Rian fired another shot, taking down one of the enforcers before glancing back at her. "Working on it!" He could see Zeke moving toward him through the haze of smoke and blaster fire, his eyes locked on Rian with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just a mission for Zeke. This was personal. With no other options, Rian grabbed Lila by the arm and pulled her toward the exit. They burst out into the alley, the cold night air hitting them like a shock as they sprinted down the narrow streets, skimmers roaring overhead. "Where do we go now?" Lila asked, her breath ragged. Rian didn't answer immediately, his mind still reeling from the encounter with Zeke. He had never imagined that they would be on opposite sides of a fight like this. But now, there was no turning back. "Follow me," he finally said, leading her deeper into the maze of alleys. As they disappeared into the shadows of Skyhold, Rian couldn't shake the feeling that his world had just shifted in a way that he could never have predicted. Zeke was no longer his friend, he was his enemy. And the line between who could be trusted and who couldn't was starting to blur in dangerous ways. And in the heart of Skyhold, nothing was as it seemed. Chapter 2. The Cost of Secrets. The alleyways of Skyhold twisted and turned, an endless maze of crumbling walls and neon signs. Rian and Lila ran through the shadows, their footsteps echoing off the metallic surfaces of the city. Overhead, skimmers zoomed past, unaware of the chase happening beneath them. They ducked into an abandoned building, the door hissing shut behind them. Rian leaned against the cold wall, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Lila was hunched over, hands on her knees, her eyes wide with the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "We can't keep running like this," she gasped. "They'll find us." Rian wiped the sweat from his brow and peered out through the cracked window. The lights of the skimmers flickered above, but they didn't seem to be searching in this direction. Yet. "They're not after us," he said, still scanning the streets outside. "They're after that chip." He turned to face Lila. "What's on it, Lila? Why is Concord willing to send my old friend and a squad of enforcers after you?" Lila straightened up, her expression hardening. She looked reluctant, but then sighed, as if finally accepting that Rian was already too deep in this to turn back. "That chip contains data on a new system Concord is developing," she said quietly. "It's called the Eye. It's a city-wide surveillance system, but it's more than that. It can tap into every device, every system, every person in Skyhold." Rian frowned. "Surveillance? That's not new. Concord's been monitoring people for years." Lila shook her head. "Not like this. The Eye is different. It doesn't just watch, it controls. It uses neural waves and biometric data to influence people's decisions, emotions, even their thoughts. It can make the entire city obedient, docile, without anyone realizing they're being manipulated." Rian stared at her in disbelief. "Mind control? You're telling me Concord's building a way to take over people's minds?" "Yes," Lila replied, her voice grim. "And once they activate it, they'll have full control over every citizen in Skyhold. No more rebellion, no more crime, just total obedience." The weight of her words hit Rian like a punch to the gut. He had known Concord was corrupt, that they controlled most aspects of life in the city. But this was a level of tyranny he hadn't imagined. "And you helped build this?" Rian asked, his voice thick with accusation. Lila flinched. "I didn't know what they were planning at first. I thought it was just another security upgrade. But when I realized what the Eye could really do, I knew I had to stop it. That's why I took the chip. It contains the key data that can shut the system down before it goes online." Rian ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. This was bigger than just a delivery gone wrong. He had unwittingly become part of a fight that could change the future of Skyhold. And Zeke, his oldest friend, was right in the middle of it, still believing that Concord was trying to protect the city. "We need to move," Rian said, pushing himself off the wall. "If Zeke is involved, they'll track us faster than we can outrun them. We need help." Lila looked at him, her expression conflicted. "Who do you have in mind? Concord controls most of the city's infrastructure. There's nowhere to hide." "There's one place." Rian's voice was steady, though he hated what he was about to suggest. "We need to go to Rourke." Lila's eyes widened. "Rourke? The leader of the outcasts? You can't be serious." "He's the only one with enough firepower to stand against Concord," Rian replied, "and he's been waiting for an opportunity like this to strike." "But Rourke can't be trusted," Lila insisted. "He used to work for Concord, and now he's just as ruthless. What makes you think he won't use the Eye for himself?" Rian turned to her, his expression hard. "I don't trust him. But right now, we don't have a choice. If we don't stop the Eye, it won't matter who's in control. Skyhold will fall under Concord's total domination." Lila bit her lip, uncertainty clouding her face. "Fine. But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. Rourke isn't someone we can afford to cross." "Agreed," Rian said, pulling his hood up and heading toward the exit. "Stick close and keep that chip safe. It's the only leverage we've got." They made their way through the underbelly of Skyhold, weaving through forgotten districts and abandoned tunnels. As they descended deeper into the city, the glow of neon lights faded, replaced by the dull hum of old machinery and the sound of dripping water. This was the domain of the outcasts, those who lived outside Concord's rule, surviving on scraps and scavenged tech. Rourke's base was hidden deep within the ruins, a crumbling section of the city that had been abandoned after an old reactor meltdown decades ago. No one ventured here unless they had business with the outcasts, and few who did ever came back unscathed. Lila stayed close to Rian as they approached the massive, rusted gates of Rourke's compound. Armed guards stood at attention, their eyes narrowing as Rian and Lila drew near. One of the guards, a broad, scarred man with a mechanical arm, stepped forward, blocking their path. "You lost, Vale?" His voice was gravelly, and he eyed Rian with suspicion. Rian gave him a cold look. "Tell Rourke I've got something he'll want to see." The guard snorted. "You think you can just waltz in here and demand an audience?" "I'm not demanding," Rian replied evenly. "But if he finds out you turn me away, I doubt you'll enjoy what happens next." The guard's eyes flickered with doubt, and he exchanged a glance with one of his comrades. After a tense moment, he stepped aside and signaled to the gatekeepers. The heavy gates creaked open, revealing the compound beyond. Rian led Lila inside, his posture tense. The compound was a chaotic mix of makeshift structures, old machinery, and scavenged tech. Outcasts of all shapes and sizes milled about, their faces worn from life outside Concord's reach. At the center of it all, sitting in a reinforced chair surrounded by armed guards, was Rourke. He was a tall, imposing man with a muscular frame, his black hair streaked with grey. A long scar ran across his jaw, a remnant of his days working for Concord. But his most striking feature was his eyes, sharp and calculating, always searching for weakness. "Well, well," Rourke said with a smirk as Rian approached. "Look who crawled out of the shadows. I didn't think I'd see you again, Vale." Rian crossed his arms. "I've got something that'll interest you." Rourke raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "You don't say. And what would that be?" Lila stepped forward, her gaze steady. "Information. On Concord's newest weapon. The Eye." Rourke's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as he focused on Lila. "The Eye, huh? I've heard whispers. Something big. Something dangerous." "It's more than that," Lila said. "It's a weapon of control, and once it's activated, Concord will have total dominance over the entire city. You won't be able to stop them." Rourke's expression darkened. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "And you think you can stop it?" Lila held up the chip. "This contains the key data that can shut it down, but we need resources, people, firepower, and you're the only one who has enough to make that happen." Rourke's eyes flicked between Lila and Rian. For a long moment he said nothing, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his lips. "You've got guts, coming here with a proposition like this," he said. "But guts don't mean much in this city unless you can back it up. How do I know this isn't a trap?" Rian met his gaze. "You don't. But if you want a shot at taking down Concord, this is your chance." Rourke stared at him for a moment longer, then let out a low chuckle. "All right, Vale, I'll play along. But if you're lying to me, well, let's just say the ruins won't be kind to you." Rian's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Deal." As Rourke's men moved to prepare for what was to come, Rian felt a knot of unease twist in his gut. He knew that trusting Rourke was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only way to stop the Eye and save Skyhold from falling under Concord's complete control. For now, they were allies. But Rian knew better than to let his guard down. In Skyhold, friends could turn into enemies in the blink of an eye. Chapter 3. Hidden Agendas. The cold air of the ruins seeped into Rian's bones as he stood at the edge of the compound, watching Rourke's men bustle around in preparation. The uneasy alliance they had forged felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Rian couldn't shake the feeling that things were spinning out of control faster than he could manage. Lila was nearby, staring at the chip in her hand as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. She looked exhausted, the burden of what she had revealed to Rian gnawing at her. He knew the weight of betrayal, having lived it firsthand, when he had turned his back on the Concord and, in turn, lost his closest friend. Zeke. Ryan's thoughts drifted back to his old friend, his mind clouded with memories of a time when life had been simpler, when loyalty was clear-cut and bonds unbreakable. 6 years earlier, the sky over Skyhold had been a blazing orange, the sun setting behind the towering skyscrapers as Rian and Zeke patrolled the perimeter of Sector 8. Back then, they had both been soldiers in the Concord Defense Corps, fresh recruits who believed they were part of something noble. Zeke had been the idealist, the one who believed that Concord's mission to bring order to the chaotic city was worth any sacrifice. "I'm telling you, Rian," Zeke had said, his voice brimming with passion as they walked side by side. "We're doing the right thing. The people here, they don't know what's best for them. They need someone to protect them from themselves." Rian had nodded, though even then a seed of doubt had been growing in his heart. Zeke's unwavering faith in the Concord had been contagious, and for a time Rian had believed it too. But the longer they served, the more he saw the cracks in the system, the cruelty behind the facade of order, the hidden costs of so-called peace. One mission in particular had shattered Rian's illusions. They had been ordered to Sector 12, the poorest and most rebellious district in Skyhold, to suppress a group of protesters. What had started as a peaceful demonstration had turned into a massacre. Concord soldiers, under orders from the top, had opened fire without warning. Rian had watched in horror as civilians were gunned down in the streets. That night, he had confronted Zeke. "Do you really think this is right?" Rian had asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Killing innocent people to maintain order? This isn't protecting anyone, it's control, Zeke. Pure and simple." Zeke had looked at him with something close to pity in his eyes. "You don't understand, Rian. Sometimes we have to make hard choices for the greater good. If we let chaos reign, the whole city falls apart." "But at what cost?" Rian had shot back. "How many more people have to die for your greater good?" Zeke had fallen silent, but the rift between them had only grown from that moment on. A few months later, Rian had walked away from the Concord, abandoning his post and leaving behind the only life he had ever known. Now, years later, the choices they had made had led them to opposite sides of an impending war. Rian shook the memory from his mind as Lila approached him, her brow furrowed with worry. "Rourke's men are getting ready," she said softly, "but I don't trust him. He's too eager to get his hands on the chip." "Neither do I," Rian replied, glancing toward Rourke, who was deep in conversation with one of his lieutenants. "But right now, he's our best shot. We can't stop Concord alone." Lila hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through her short-cropped hair. "I didn't sign up for this, you know. I thought I could change things from the inside, that if I worked hard enough, I could make Concord see that there was a better way." Rian looked at her, curious. "You were with Concord for a long time, weren't you? Before you left?" Lila nodded, her gaze distant. "I grew up in Sector 4, one of the nice districts. My family wasn't rich, but we were comfortable. I got into Concord Engineering Academy on a scholarship and thought I'd hit the jackpot. I believed in the dream. Clean energy, advanced tech, a better future for Skyhold. But once I started working for them, I realized how deep the rot went." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They don't care about the future. They only care about control. Everything they do is to keep the city under their thumb. The eye, it's just the latest step in a plan that's been in the works for decades." Rian felt a pang of empathy. Lila's story wasn't so different from his own. She had once believed in something greater, only to be disillusioned by the harsh reality of Concord's true intentions. "We all have our reasons for walking away," Rian said quietly. "But what matters now is that we stop them before it's too late." Lila nodded, but her expression remained grim. "If we don't, Skyhold will be lost." As the sun began to set, casting the ruins in a deep red glow, Rourke finally approached them. His lieutenants trailed behind him, their faces grim and determined. Rourke looked at Rian, then Lila, his expression unreadable. "My men are ready," he said, his voice low and authoritative. "We hit Concord's central facility in Sector 1 tonight. That's where they're keeping the mainframe for the Eye." "Tonight?" Rian asked, surprised. "Isn't that rushing things a bit?" Rourke's eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the towering spires of Concord's headquarters loomed in the distance. "We don't have time to wait. Concord is moving faster than we thought. We have to strike before they can activate the system." Lila stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "I'll go with you. I know the layout of the facility. I helped design part of it." Rourke raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Fine, but you stick with my team. I don't need you getting in the way." Rian's gaze hardened. "We do this together. No one gets left behind." Rourke smirked. "You've always been sentimental, Vale, but don't worry, I've got no interest in dying tonight." Rian nodded, though a knot of anxiety twisted in his gut. He didn't trust Rourke, but there was no other option. If they failed tonight, Skyhold would fall into a darkness far worse than any of them could imagine. Later that night, under the cover of darkness, Rourke's small force moved silently through the streets of Sector 1. The towering spires of Concord's headquarters loomed above them, the neon lights flickering ominously in the foggy sky. The mainframe for the Eye was located deep within the central tower, a fortress of glass and steel guarded by Concord's most elite soldiers. Rian, Lila, and Rourke crouched behind a row of abandoned vehicles, their eyes scanning the perimeter. Concord enforcers patrolled the area in tight formation, their faces hidden behind black visors, their movements precise and mechanical. "Are you sure about this?" Lila whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of the city. Rian nodded. "It's now or never. We get in, disable the mainframe, and get out. Quick and clean." "Quick and clean," Rourke echoed with a grin, though there was something dangerous in his eyes. "Just how I like it." Rian kept his focus on the task ahead, but his instincts were screaming at him. Something about this felt off. Rourke's eagerness to strike, his confidence in their success. It all felt too easy. As they prepared to move, Rian caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye. A skimmer hovering silently in the shadows. His heart raced as he recognized the figure inside. Zeke. Rian froze, his mind spinning. Zeke was here, leading the patrol, no doubt. Concord's perfect soldier, still loyal to the cause, still convinced he was fighting for the greater good. For a moment, their eyes met, and Rian felt a pang of sorrow. They had once been like brothers, fighting side by side. Now, they were enemies, caught in a battle neither of them had asked for. But there was no time for hesitation. The mission had to come first. "Let's move," Rian whispered, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. The team crept forward, slipping past the patrols and making their way toward the central tower. Every step brought them closer to the heart of Concord's power, and every step felt like a march toward inevitable betrayal. Rian just didn't know who would strike first. Chapter 4. The Price of Loyalty. The night air was thick with tension as Rian, Lila, and Rourke's team edged closer to the central tower. The looming spire, wrapped in glass and steel, reflected the neon hues of Skyhold, giving it a cold, indifferent beauty. For a moment, Rian paused, staring up at the monolith, feeling the weight of the city pressing down on him. This was it, the heart of Concord, and the place where everything could go horribly wrong. "We'll go in through the maintenance shaft," Lila whispered, pointing toward a hidden entry she knew from her days as an engineer. "It'll take us directly to the lower levels, where the mainframe is located." Rourke gave her a sharp nod, motioning for his men to take position. The team slipped into the shadows, moving with military precision, though there was an unmistakable aura of tension among them. Rian couldn't shake the feeling that this alliance was hanging by a thread, ready to snap at the slightest misstep. As they approached the shaft, Rian felt a familiar presence nearby, his instincts prickling with unease. Zeke. His old friend was closer than before, leading the patrols with the same sense of duty that had once bound them together. Lila quickly unlocked the maintenance hatch, her fingers working with the ease of someone who knew Concord systems inside and out. The hatch hissed open, and Rourke's men disappeared inside without a word. Before following, Rian glanced at Rourke, whose smile seemed a little too eager. Rourke had never been one for subtlety, and his excitement about this mission, about the power they were walking into, was impossible to ignore. The team entered the dark, narrow tunnel, the sound of their footsteps muffled against the metal walls. Lila led the way, her eyes sharp as she navigated the twisting corridors. Every step felt heavier as they drew closer to the mainframe. "We'll split into 2 teams," Rourke whispered once they reached a fork in the tunnel. "You take half the men, Vale, and head to the primary server room. I'll take the rest to the control center." Rian hesitated. Splitting up now seemed like a dangerous move. Why split up? We need to stay together if we're going to pull this off. Rourke's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Trust me, Vale. If things go south, having 2 teams increases our chances of success. Besides, you'll need backup when you reach the server room. It's where the mainframe's core is stored." Rian clenched his jaw but nodded. They were in too deep to argue, and any more delay would only increase the chances of Concord detecting them. He motioned for half of Rourke's men to follow him, while the others stayed with Rourke. Lila stayed by Rian's side, her face set in determination, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. She leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "Be careful, Rian. I don't trust Rourke. He's planning something." "I know," Rian whispered back. "Stay close. We'll get through this." As Rian's team neared the server room, the narrow tunnel opened up into a cavernous chamber filled with whirring machines and rows of glowing screens. This was the heart of the EYES system, the place where Concord's data, surveillance, and control mechanisms all converged. Lila moved quickly to one of the consoles, plugging in the chip. Her fingers danced across the keys as she worked to bypass the system's security protocols. The room hummed with energy, the lights flickering as the data streamed through. "We don't have much time," Lila muttered, sweat beading on her forehead. "Once I access the mainframe, Concord will know we're here." Rian's eyes scanned the room, his muscles tensing as he waited for the inevitable. Something felt wrong, too easy, too quiet. He could feel the tension in the air, like a storm about to break. Suddenly a faint echo reverberated through the chamber, the sound of boots. Rian's heart sank. "Get ready!" he hissed, drawing his weapon as the footsteps grew louder. His team took cover, their weapons trained on the door. It slid open with a hiss, revealing a figure that Rian both dreaded and longed to see. Zeke. His old friend stepped through the doorway, his black Concord uniform pristine, his face unreadable behind the helmet. His weapon was raised, though he hadn't fired. Behind him, a squad of enforcers spread out, their visors gleaming under the cold fluorescent lights. Ryan, Zeke said, his voice calm, though there was a hardness to it. I knew you'd come here. Ryan stepped forward, keeping his weapon lowered but ready. His heart ached at the sight of Zeke, the boy he had grown up with, now a soldier of the regime he had come to despise. It doesn't have to end like this, Rian said, his voice steady, though his emotions churned inside. You don't know what Concord's planning. The Eye. It's not just surveillance, it's mind control, Zeke. They'll turn everyone in Skyhold into puppets. Zeke's eyes flickered with something, hesitation perhaps, but then his expression hardened again. You think I don't know that? You think Concord hasn't told me the price of peace? But it's the only way, Ryan. Without control, this city will tear itself apart. Ryan's grip tightened on his weapon. You've become everything we fought against, Zeke. You're defending a system that will strip people of their freedom, their will. How can you still believe this is the right thing? Zeke's eyes burned with conviction. Because I believe in the greater good. Sometimes we have to make sacrifices. The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Sacrifice. It was the justification that had torn them apart before, and now it was the wedge that would decide their fate. Before Ryan could respond, a series of explosions echoed from deeper within the facility. The lights flickered violently, and the ground shook beneath their feet. Rourke. Ryan's blood ran cold as he realized what had happened. Rourke hadn't just planned to shut down the Eye, he had planned to destroy the entire facility, likely wiping out anyone inside, including Concord's soldiers, his own men, and them. Lila's voice cut through the chaos. Ryan, we've been double-crossed. Rourke set explosives throughout the building. He's planning to wipe everything out, us included. Zeke's eyes widened as the implications hit him. He looked at Ryan, the cold certainty in his gaze crumbling into something like desperation. You knew about this? No, Ryan said, shaking his head. This isn't my plan. Rourke's gone rogue. We need to get out of here before this whole place goes up. But it was too late. The explosions were spreading, and the walls trembled as more charges detonated. The enforcers moved into action, their weapons trained on Ryan and his team. Chaos erupted in the room as both sides exchanged fire. Lila ducked behind cover, working frantically to extract the data from the mainframe as the gunfight raged around her. I need more time, she shouted, her fingers flying over the keys. Ryan fired at the advancing enforcers, his heart pounding as he tried to figure out a way to salvage the situation. Zeke was trapped between his loyalty to Concord and the reality of the betrayal they were both facing. Zeke, Ryan shouted over the din, this isn't what either of us wanted. You know Rourke won't stop until he takes over Skyhold. Help me stop him. We can still make things right. For a moment, Zeke hesitated, his weapon lowering slightly. It was the first crack in his armor of loyalty, the first sign that perhaps, somewhere beneath the layers of obedience, the friend Ryan had once known still existed. But then, with a look of grim determination, Zeke raised his weapon again. I can't, Ryan. I won't betray Concord. The words were like a knife to Ryan's heart. Before he could respond, another explosion rocked the building, and the ceiling above them began to collapse. Debris rained down, and Ryan could hear the screams of men being crushed under the weight of falling metal. In that instant, Zeke made his decision. He turned and ran toward the exit, his soldiers following him in retreat as the facility began to tear itself apart. Rian's heart ached as he watched Zeke disappear into the smoke. His oldest friend was lost to him, perhaps forever. But there was no time to mourn. Lila screamed as the server room began to crumble around them. Ryan, we need to go. Now! Ryan grabbed Lila's arm and pulled her away from the console, the data transfer incomplete. They raced toward the exit, dodging falling debris and explosions that shook the very ground beneath their feet. As they reached the maintenance shaft, Rian caught sight of Rourke, standing on a platform above them, a smirk plastered on his face. "Enjoy the show, Vale?" Rourke called, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I told you there's only one way to take down Concord, and that's to burn them to the ground." Rian's blood boiled with rage. Rourke had betrayed them all, and now the entire city was at risk. He wasn't here to save Skyhold, he was here to rule it, no matter the cost. With a roar of anger, Rian fired his weapon at Rourke, but the leader of the rebellion was already disappearing into the smoke, leaving chaos in his wake. As the building collapsed around them, Rian and Lila barely made it out, stumbling into the streets of Sector 1 as the central tower crumbled into a smoldering ruin behind them. Skyhold was on the brink of war, and everything Rian had fought for was falling apart. His friend was now his enemy, and the man he had allied with had become the greatest threat of all. But one thing was clear, the battle for Skyhold had only just begun. Chapter 5. Ashes of the Past. Zeke leaned against the cold steel wall of Concord's elite barracks, his helmet resting on the table beside him, fingers running through his hair in frustration. The sounds of the recent battle echoed in his mind: gunfire, explosions, the hiss of collapsing steel. But more than the sounds of violence, it was Rian's words that haunted him, gnawing at the walls of his carefully constructed loyalty. "You've become everything we fought against. How can you still believe this is the right thing?" The echo of Rian's voice was worse than any explosion. It pierced through Zeke's defenses, leaving a wound that refused to heal. He had spent years convincing himself that the path he had chosen was the right one, that Concord's iron grip on Skyhold was the only way to prevent the city from devouring itself in chaos. And yet, hearing those words from Rian, the friend who had once been like a brother to him, made Zeke question everything. He had always been good at shutting out the doubts, compartmentalizing the horrors he had witnessed, the sacrifices he had made. But now, those walls were crumbling. Zeke squeezed his eyes shut, willing the images away. Rian, standing there, pleading with him. The sight of Rourke's men tearing through Concord's forces, not as liberators, but as predators, hungry for control. For the first time in years, Zeke wasn't sure which side was right anymore. "Sir?" Zeke snapped out of his reverie, his lieutenant, Sergeant Kara, standing at the door, her face impassive. She was one of Concord's finest, loyal and unyielding, everything Zeke had strived to be. "What is it, Kara?" Zeke asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "There's a briefing in 10 minutes. Commander Delan wants an update on the situation at the central tower," she replied crisply. Zeke nodded, pushing himself up from the chair. "I'll be there." As Kara turned to leave, she hesitated, glancing back at him. "Sir, the men are talking. They saw what happened with Vale in the server room. Some of them are concerned about where your loyalties lie." Zeke's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what she meant. The doubts were not just his own. They were spreading through the ranks. His hesitation during the fight, his decision to withdraw rather than engage Rian, Concord's soldiers had noticed, and they were starting to question him. "I'm loyal to Concord, Sergeant," Zeke said firmly, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. "I'll deal with the men." Kara nodded, but the doubt in her eyes lingered as she left the room. 6 years earlier, when Zeke had first joined the Concord Defense Corps, he had believed in the dream of a united Skyhold, a city brought under one banner, one rule, where chaos and corruption would be eradicated. He had always been the idealist, while Rian had been more pragmatic, questioning things that Zeke had taken as necessary sacrifices. Zeke remembered the night they had first fought over Concord's methods. It had been after the massacre in Sector 12, when their squad had been ordered to suppress a rebellion. What started as a peaceful protest had ended in a bloodbath, civilians gunned down in the streets. "You don't understand, Zeke," Rian had said, pacing in their quarters, his eyes wild with anger. "We're not the heroes here. We're part of the problem. You saw what happened today. That wasn't about maintaining peace. That was about control. Zeke had been shaken, but his conviction had remained firm. You're wrong, Rian. We had no choice. If we let them rise up, the entire city would fall into chaos. People die in war. That's the price we pay for peace. And what if the price is too high? Rian had shot back. How many more people have to die for you to realize that what we're doing isn't peace, it's tyranny? Zeke had walked away from that argument, refusing to see what Rian had seen. But now, as he sat in the barracks, surrounded by the cold, sterile walls of Concord's fortress, those words came back to him with a vengeance. The briefing room was filled with senior officers, their faces grim as they discussed the fallout from Rourke's attack. The central tower was in ruins, and Concord's hold over the city was beginning to slip. The rebellion was spreading, emboldened by Rourke's brazen assault, and now the once untouchable grip of Concord was starting to weaken. Commander Delanne stood at the head of the table, his eyes sharp as they fell on Zeke. Delanne was a man of few words, but his presence commanded respect. He had been one of the architects of Concord's rise to power, and his loyalty to the regime was absolute. "Lieutenant Zeke," Delanne said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your report on the situation at the central tower." Zeke stood tall, his expression neutral. "We encountered heavy resistance from Rourke's forces. They had inside knowledge of the facility's layout, likely from former Concord engineers who defected. Rourke used explosives to destroy the tower, and while we managed to secure some key systems, much of the infrastructure has been lost." Delanne's gaze narrowed. "And Vale? What of your former comrade?" Zeke felt the eyes of the room turn to him, the weight of their scrutiny pressing down on him like a vice. He knew what they were looking for: signs of weakness, hesitation, any indication that his loyalty had wavered. "Vale escaped," Zeke said evenly. "He's aligned himself with Rourke, but it's clear he's operating under his own agenda. He believes Rourke is a means to an end, not an ally." Delanne studied him for a moment, then leaned forward, his eyes boring into Zeke's. "I need to know something, Lieutenant. When you encountered Vale in the server room, why didn't you take the shot? You had a clear opportunity to eliminate a key threat to Concord." Zeke's pulse quickened, though he kept his expression calm. He had known this question was coming. Rian Vale is not the real threat. Rourke is the one with the resources and the power to bring down Concord. Vale is a distraction. Delanne's eyes flickered with something, doubt or perhaps suspicion. "Vale is a symbol, Lieutenant. He represents the rebellion's ability to turn Concord's own against us. If we don't stop him, others will follow." Zeke's heart pounded in his chest. He had spent years convincing himself that Concord was right, that the sacrifices they made were necessary. But now, standing here in front of Delanne, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't sure he believed it anymore. "I understand, sir," Zeke replied, his voice steady. "Next time, I won't hesitate." Delanne stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "See that you don't." Later that night, Zeke found himself wandering the darkened corridors of Concord's command center. The sterile walls and harsh lighting felt suffocating, a far cry from the streets of Skyhold, where life, chaotic, messy, and uncontrolled, breathed around every corner. He ended up in the observation room overlooking the city. From here, he could see the sprawl of Skyhold beneath him, a patchwork of glowing lights, skyscrapers, and distant streets. It was beautiful in a way, but also distant, cold, like something he no longer recognized. Rian's words came back to him once more. "How can you still believe this is the right thing?" Zeke closed his eyes, his fists clenching at his sides. He had dedicated his life to Concord, had sacrificed everything for the belief that order was the only way to save the city. But now, After seeing the destruction wrought by Rourke, after hearing Ryan's plea, the certainty that had once grounded him was slipping through his fingers. His comm device buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. Zeke glanced down, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name on the screen. Rian Vale. For a moment, Zeke just stared at the message. It was a simple transmission, encrypted but clear. He knew the protocol. Rian was reaching out through an old secure line they used to use during joint missions when trust was still a given between them. Zeke hesitated, his thumb hovering over the response button. Accepting this call could mean betrayal, both of Rian and of Concord. But ignoring it felt like a betrayal of something deeper, something in himself. With a deep breath, Zeke accepted the transmission. "Rian," he said quietly, his voice a mixture of caution and familiarity. "Zeke," came Ryan's voice, calm but strained. "I didn't think you'd answer." Zeke exhaled, leaning against the glass wall overlooking the city. "I'm not sure why I did." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Rian spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I know you still believe in Concord, but you have to see what's happening, Zeke. Rourke's not the only one who's dangerous. Concord is changing, becoming something darker, something we never signed up for." Chapter 6. The Gathering Storm. Zeke left the observation room, his mind a battlefield of warring loyalties. Ryan's words had shaken him to his core, but Concord's grip on him was still strong. He had spent years believing in the regime's vision, defending it, sacrificing for it. Yet now, cracks were forming in the foundation of that belief, and with each passing moment, the choice before him became more impossible. As he walked through the dimly lit corridors of the Concord Command Center, a sense of foreboding settled over him. The city of Skyhold, divided and on the brink of collapse, mirrored his internal conflict. His comm device vibrated again, but this time it wasn't Ryan. It was Commander Delan. Zeke's heart sank as he answered the call. Delan was not a man who tolerated indecision. "Lieutenant!" Delan's voice crackled through the speaker. "I need you in my office immediately." Zeke nodded to himself, already changing direction. "On my way, sir." Delan's office was as cold and austere as the man himself. The walls were lined with tactical maps of Skyhold, with red markers indicating the sectors under rebel influence. Behind the commander's desk was a large window overlooking the city, much like the observation room Zeke had just left. But here, the view felt oppressive, a constant reminder of Concord's failing control. Delan was waiting for him, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the city. When Zeke entered, he didn't turn around. "Lieutenant," Delan began, his voice heavy with authority, "we have a problem." Zeke stood at attention, though every instinct in him was on high alert. "What kind of problem, sir?" Delan finally turned, his icy blue eyes locking onto Zeke's with unnerving intensity. "Rourke is becoming more dangerous by the hour. His forces have gained control over Sector 8, and there are reports of defectors from our ranks joining him, but that's not the real issue." Zeke's pulse quickened. He had a bad feeling about where this was going. "We've intercepted a transmission," Delan continued, stepping closer to Zeke. "From Vale." The breath caught in Zeke's throat. He struggled to keep his expression neutral, but the tightening in his chest betrayed his anxiety. Delan didn't miss it. His eyes narrowed. "You seem concerned, Lieutenant." "I wasn't aware of the transmission, sir," Zeke replied carefully, his mind racing. If Concord had intercepted his conversation with Rian, it could mean the end of his career and his life. Delan's lips curled into a thin smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Perhaps not. but we know Vale reached out to someone inside our ranks, someone close to him. Zeke's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had to tread carefully. "Sir, if you're suggesting that I'm not suggesting anything, Lieutenant," Delan interrupted sharply. "I'm giving you an order. I want Vale dead. No more hesitation, no more games. You will be the one to do it. Do I make myself clear?" Zeke's blood turned cold. Dalen was watching him closely, gauging his reaction. This wasn't just an order. It was a test. Concord was suspicious, and now Zeke had no choice but to prove his loyalty. "Yes, sir," Zeke said, his voice tight. "I understand." Delan nodded, satisfied for now. "Good. You leave tomorrow morning. Failure is not an option." Zeke saluted and turned to leave, but as his hand touched the door, Delan's voice stopped him. "One more thing, Lieutenant." Zeke turned back, meeting Delan's steely gaze. "If I even suspect that your loyalty is compromised," Delan said softly, "I will personally see to it that you're executed as a traitor. Do I make myself clear?" Zeke felt a chill run down his spine. "Crystal clear, sir." Back in his quarters, Zeke sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the floor. The weight of Delan's order pressed down on him like a vice. He had known this moment was coming, the point where his loyalty would be tested beyond anything he had ever imagined. But now that it was here, he didn't know if he could go through with it. Kill Rian, his friend, his brother in arms, the man who had saved his life more times than he could count. Could he really do it? Zeke's thoughts spiraled, pulling him deeper into doubt. He could still hear Ryan's voice from the transmission, pleading with him to see the truth, to remember who they used to be. But now, Rian was more than just a rebel. He was a symbol of everything Concord wanted to destroy, a threat to the order Zeke had sworn to protect. Yet, in his heart, Zeke knew the real threat wasn't Rian. It was Concord. The regime he had once believed in so blindly was becoming something monstrous, a machine that crushed anyone who dared stand against it. And Zeke was beginning to realize that he was just another cog in that machine. The door to his quarters slid open, and Zeke jumped, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. But it was only Kara, his lieutenant and closest confidant within Concord. "Zeke," she said, her voice low, "we need to talk." Zeke stood, forcing himself to push the turmoil down. "What is it, Kara?" She stepped closer, her expression serious. "The men are restless. Word spreading fast about what happened at the central tower. They're starting to question our mission. Question you." Zeke clenched his jaw. He had known this was coming. Concord's soldiers were trained to follow orders without question, but even they had their limits. The destruction of the central tower, coupled with Ryan's growing influence, had sown seeds of doubt. "I'm handling it," Zeke said, though the uncertainty in his own voice betrayed him. Kara studied him for a moment, then lowered her voice. "Are you?" Zeke met her gaze, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that shook him. Doubt. Kara had always been loyal to Concord, but more than that, she had been loyal to Zeke, and now even she was beginning to question him. "You know what Delan ordered," Zeke said, his voice tight. "He wants Rian dead. I'm supposed to be the one to do it." Kara's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't seem surprised. "And are you going to?" Zeke turned away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't know. I don't know if I can." Kara's voice softened, and when she spoke again, it was with the tone of someone who had seen too much. "Zeke, we've all made sacrifices for this city, but at some point, we have to ask ourselves if those sacrifices are worth it. Rian might be a rebel, but he's not the enemy. You know that." Zeke clenched his fists. He had spent years trying to shut out that truth, but now it was staring him in the face. "What are you saying, Kara?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying," she replied, stepping closer, "that maybe it's time to stop fighting for Concord. Maybe it's time to fight for something real, for Skyhold, for the people, not for Delan." Zeke's breath caught in his throat. Kara, of all people, was telling him to betray Concord. It was unthinkable, and yet the truth in her words resonated deep within him. He was on the verge of making a decision that would change everything. Before he could respond, his comm device buzzed again. Zeke glanced at the screen and felt his heart drop. It was Lila. She had been quiet since the mission, her distance troubling Zeke more than he liked to admit. He knew Lila was struggling with everything that had happened, Rourke's betrayal, the crumbling alliance between the rebels and Concord. But now, as her name appeared on his comm, Zeke felt a deep sense of foreboding. He answered, "Lila?" Her voice was strained, almost breathless. "Zeke, we need to talk. Now." Zeke glanced at Kara, then back to his comm. "Where are you?" "I'm in Sector 3. There's something you need to know about Rourke. It changes everything." Zeke moved through the dimly lit streets of Sector 3 with a sense of urgency. His mind was racing with questions about Rourke, about Concord, about Lila. What had she discovered? And why did it feel like everything was unraveling around him? When he reached the rendezvous point, he found Lila standing in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. "Lila," Zeke said as he approached, his voice low. "What's going on?" She turned to him, and Zeke immediately noticed the trembling in her hands. "Rourke," she whispered. He's not who we thought he was." Zeke's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Lila took a shaky breath, her voice barely holding together. "I overheard him talking with one of his lieutenants. Zeke, Rourke isn't who we think he is." Chapter 7. The Edge of Betrayal. Zeke stood frozen, the weight of Lila's revelation pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Rourke, a man he had been fighting against for years, a supposed champion of the rebellion, was secretly working with Concord. Everything he thought he knew was unraveling. The battlefield in his mind shifted yet again, and now the blurred lines between friend and enemy had all but disappeared. "You're sure about this?" Zeke's voice was hoarse, as if speaking the words made them more real. Lila nodded, her expression raw with fear and frustration. "I heard him, Zeke. Rourke's been in contact with Concord for months. He's been playing both sides, pretending to be our ally while feeding them intel. This entire rebellion, it's a sham. We've all been pawns." Zeke's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. If Rourke was a double agent, then the rebellion wasn't just doomed, it had never stood a chance from the start. But the question that lingered, sharp and painful, was why? Why would Concord make a deal with someone like Rourke, a man who outwardly defied everything they stood for? Why would Concord even work with him? Zeke asked, narrowing his eyes. What does Rourke get out of betraying everyone like this? Lila's face hardened. Power. Concord doesn't care about the people. They care about control. They'll give him Skyhold if it means maintaining order. And Rourke, he'll sacrifice anyone to get what he wants. The realization hit Zeke like a ton of bricks. Rourke wasn't interested in liberating Skyhold. He wasn't a rebel leader. He was a self-serving tyrant in the making. And now Zeke was caught in the crossfire of two ruthless players, Rourke and Concord. both willing to sacrifice anyone to achieve their goals. But Zeke wasn't sure who he was anymore either. "We have to stop him," Zeke said finally, the words coming out as a command. He didn't know how yet, but he couldn't let Rourke destroy the city or let Concord tighten their grip. "We can't let Rourke or Concord win." Lila met his gaze, and for the first time in a long while, Zeke saw hope flicker in her eyes. "We can expose him. If we get proof, we can turn the people against him. Maybe we can even make Concord soldiers see the truth." But Zeke knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Concord wasn't just a regime, it was a machine, and Rourke wasn't some rebel leader who could be easily unseated. They were dealing with forces that could crush them both without a second thought. Exposing Rourke was the only move they had, but it was risky. If they failed, they'd be executed as traitors. Zeke looked at Lila, then at the city beyond. "I'll handle Rourke," he said firmly. "You need to get this information to someone who can use it. The rebels, anyone still loyal to the cause." Lila hesitated, fear flashing in her eyes. "You're going after Rourke alone?" Zeke nodded. "I've already been ordered to take him out, but now I know what he really is. He's not just a traitor to Concord, he's a traitor to this city." Lila grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "Zeke, if you go after him, he'll know you're onto him. And Delon won't hesitate to execute you if you fail." Zeke's jaw tightened. He had already made his decision. "I've made worse enemies." Chapter 8. The Breaking Point. The underground bunker where Rourke had made his base of operations was heavily fortified, with multiple layers of security that made it nearly impossible to infiltrate. But Zeke had something most of Rourke's men didn't: his rank within Concord. For now, that rank would get him past most of the guards without question. Zeke moved through the shadows of the city, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear and resolve. Every step closer to Rourke felt like another step toward an uncertain fate. He had to be careful. He was walking into a den of wolves, and one wrong move could cost him everything. As he neared Rourke's bunker, his comm buzzed. It was Kara. Zeke froze, his mind immediately racing. Why was she calling him now? Could she know what he was planning? Reluctantly, Zeke answered. "Kara." "Zeke," her voice came through, steady as always. "Where are you?" Zeke hesitated, his instincts telling him not to trust anyone, not even Kara, the woman who had been his closest ally within Concord. But the tone in her voice, something was wrong. "I'm on a mission," Zeke replied carefully. "What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end, and when Kara spoke again, her voice was low. "Delon suspects you're not going to follow through with your orders." Zeke's blood ran cold. "What?" "I don't know how, but he's watching you. He thinks you're going soft. He's already sent a team to your last known location. If you're planning something, Zeke, you need to be careful. He's not going to give you another chance." Zeke clenched his teeth. He had been so focused on Rourke that he hadn't considered Delon would be watching him so closely. Now, not only was he walking into enemy territory, but he was being hunted by his own commander. "Kara," Zeke said, his voice tight, "you don't have to do this. You don't have to stay loyal to Concord." There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment Zeke thought she might actually be considering his words. But when she spoke again, her voice was cold. "I'm not the one who needs to question their loyalty, Zeke. I hope you know what you're doing." The call ended, leaving Zeke standing in the shadows, his heart racing.
Kara's words were a warning, but there was no turning back now. He was caught between Delan's suspicions and Rourke's treachery, and the only way out was through.
The entrance to Rourke's bunker was guarded by two of his men, both armed with heavy rifles. Zeke approached with his helmet on, keeping his face hidden. His Concord credentials allowed him to pass through the first checkpoint without incident, but his heart was pounding in his chest. The closer he got to Rourke, the more dangerous this mission became. Inside, the bunker was a maze of narrow corridors and makeshift rooms. Zeke moved quickly, avoiding eye contact with the rebels who patrolled the area. He had one goal in mind: get to Rourke before he could escape. When he finally reached Rourke's office, Zeke found the door ajar. The faint sound of voices drifted through the crack. "I told you! Everything is in motion!" Rourke's deep voice came through. "Delan will take the fall, and Concord will give me the city. All we have to do is wait." Zeke's blood boiled as he listened. Rourke had already sealed the fate of Skyhold, selling out both the rebels and Concord in one fell swoop. He was playing everyone, just as Lila had said. Zeke pushed open the door, his hand hovering over his sidearm. Inside, Rourke sat behind his desk, his lieutenant standing nearby. Both men looked up in surprise as Zeke entered, but Rourke's expression quickly turned into a grin. "Ah, Lieutenant Vale," Rourke said, leaning back in his chair. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Zeke's hand tightened on his weapon. "It's over, Rourke. I know what you're doing."
Rourke raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. "Do you now? And what exactly is that?" Zeke stepped forward, his voice cold. "You've been playing both sides, feeding Concord information while pretending to lead the rebellion. You're nothing but a traitor." Rourke's grin widened. "Traitor? That's a funny word coming from a Concord lapdog. Tell me, Zeke, how's your precious Delan doing these days? Still making sure the city stays nice and obedient?" Zeke felt his pulse quicken. Rourke was baiting him, trying to provoke a reaction, but Zeke wouldn't let him get under his skin. "I'm here to stop you," Zeke said, his voice steady. "Whatever you're planning, it ends now." Rourke laughed, a low, rumbling sound that echoed through the room. "Oh, Zeke, you think you can stop this? You're too late. The city is already mine. Concord doesn't care about Skyhold. They never did. And the rebellion, it's a joke. They're all pawns in a much bigger game." Zeke's hand tightened on his sidearm, but before he could draw it, Rourke's lieutenant stepped forward, raising his weapon. But Rourke held up a hand, stopping the man. "No need for that," Rourke said, his eyes never leaving Zeke. "Let the lieutenant make his move."
Zeke's mind raced, calculating his next move. He could take out Rourke, end this once and for all. But then what? Delan would still be after him, and Skyhold would still be in chaos. Killing Rourke wouldn't solve everything, but maybe it could be the first step. With a swift motion, Zeke drew his sidearm and aimed it at Rourke's head. "I'm not playing your game anymore." Rourke's smile faltered for the first time. "Then make your move, Lieutenant." Zeke's finger hovered over the trigger, his heart pounding in his chest. He had the power to end this, to stop Rourke's betrayal and take control of his own fate. But as he stood there, weapon raised, Zeke felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Rourke or Concord anymore. This was about the city, the people of Skyhold who had been caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. Zeke lowered his weapon.
Rourke's grin returned. Smart choice. But Zeke wasn't finished. You're not walking out of here, Rourke. Not after what you've done. Rourke's expression darkened, but before he could respond, the door behind Zeke burst open.
Kara stood there, her weapon drawn, eyes blazing with fury. "Zeke, move!" she shouted. Zeke barely had time to react before Kara fired. The shot hit Rourke square in the chest, and he collapsed to the ground with a strangled gasp. Zeke stared in shock as Rourke's body hit the floor, blood pooling around him. He looked up at Kara, who lowered her weapon, her face unreadable. "You hesitated?" Kara said coldly. "I didn't." Zeke felt a wave of confusion and betrayal wash over him. "Why?" Kara stepped closer, her voice hard. "You were never going to do it, Zeke. You don't have what it takes. But I do." Zeke's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Kara had killed Rourke, but why? Was she still loyal to Concord, or had she made her own power play? Before Zeke could ask, Kara turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing alone with Rourke's lifeless body. Zeke looked down at the man he had once considered his enemy and realized that in this war there were no clear sides anymore. Only chaos. Chapter 9. Shattered Loyalties. Zeke stood frozen over Rourke's lifeless body, the weight of Kara's betrayal crashing over him like a tidal wave. His thoughts were jumbled, swirling with confusion and anger. He'd lowered his weapon, unwilling to pull the trigger, and Kara had acted without hesitation. She had saved him from making a choice he wasn't sure he could live with, but in doing so, she had shown just how far she was willing to go. Zeke had always seen Kara as an unwavering ally, someone with a strict code, just like him. But now the coldness in her eyes haunted him. Her words, "You don't have what it takes," cut deep. Was that really who she thought he was? And more importantly, was that who he had become? Kara had left without explaining, without even a backward glance. Her swift, decisive actions only deepened Zeke's inner turmoil. He wasn't sure who to trust anymore. He'd hesitated with Rourke because he thought there might be another way, but Kara's willingness to kill without a second thought made him question everything he knew about her. He knelt beside Rourke's body, the weight of the moment settling in. He reached into Rourke's jacket, searching for anything that might provide answers. His fingers brushed against a small data chip embedded in a hidden compartment. Zeke extracted it, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Whatever was on this chip could be the key to understanding Rourke's plans, or Concord's deeper intentions. Zeke pocketed the chip and rose to his feet. The room was eerily silent, the tension between loyalty and betrayal thick in the air. He had to get out of here, had to figure out his next move. But first, he needed to find Kara and understand what had just happened. Chapter 10. Lines in the Sand. Zeke made his way through the narrow corridors of the underground bunker, his steps quick and purposeful. The guards let him pass without question, unaware of what had just transpired in Rourke's office. As he emerged into the night, the city of Skyhold sprawled before him, bathed in the dim glow of neon lights and the hum of distant drones patrolling the skies. The city felt like a living, breathing entity, a battleground where alliances shifted as easily as the wind. His comm buzzed again, but this time he hesitated before answering. He knew it could be Kara or even Delan questioning his loyalty, testing his resolve. Finally he answered, but his voice was steely, prepared for anything. "Zeke!" Kara's voice came through again, calm, but with an edge of impatience. "Meet me at the old factory near the south quadrant. We need to talk." Zeke clenched his jaw. "You've got some explaining to do." "I know, just get here." The line went dead, leaving Zeke alone with his thoughts. As he made his way to the factory, every step felt heavier. He couldn't shake the image of Kara pulling the trigger on Rourke without hesitation. She had saved him, yes, but why? Was it truly for the cause, or was she playing her own game?
The abandoned factory loomed over Zeke as he approached, its rusted frame a relic of the city's forgotten past. Inside, the space was vast and empty, filled only with the echoes of distant machinery long silenced. In the center of the room, Kara stood waiting, her arms crossed, her face as unreadable as ever. "Rourke's dead," Zeke said, stepping forward, his eyes locked on hers. "You killed him. Now tell me why."
Kara didn't flinch. "I did what had to be done. You were going to let him walk, Zeke. I couldn't risk that." "You don't know what I was going to do," Zeke snapped. "I was trying to figure out another way." "There was no other way," Kara replied, her voice sharp. "Rourke was a threat to everything. Concord, the rebellion, Skyhold itself. He would have burned the city to the ground if it meant gaining power." Zeke shook his head, frustrated. "That doesn't explain why you acted so quickly. You've always followed orders, Kara. But this felt personal."
Kara's expression softened for a moment, but then her guard went back up. "We don't have the luxury of waiting around, Zeke. Not anymore. Delan's closing in and the rebellion is falling apart. If we don't act decisively, we're all going to be crushed between two factions that care more about control than the people they're supposed to protect."
Zeke stared at her, his mind reeling. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we're out of time," Kara replied. "Delan already knows something's off. He suspects you're no longer loyal. If he finds out we took out Rourke without his approval, we're dead." Zeke felt a pang of fear, but pushed it down. "So what's the plan then? We just disappear?" Kara stepped closer, her voice lowering. "No, we expose Delan." Zeke blinked, stunned by the suggestion. "Expose him? Delan controls Concord's operations in Skyhold. He has the entire city under surveillance. How are we supposed to take him down?" Kara's eyes flickered with something Zeke hadn't seen in her before, an intensity that bordered on desperation. "We have something that can turn the tide, Zeke. Something big."
Zeke felt a pit form in his stomach. "What are you talking about?"
Kara reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device, its sleek black casing reflecting the dim light. Rourke wasn't the only one playing both sides. Delan has been working with rebel factions, but not in the way we thought. He's been orchestrating the chaos in Skyhold, keeping both sides weak so Concord can maintain control. Zeke's mind raced. "You have proof of this?" Kara nodded. "This device contains intercepted communications between Delan and rebel leaders. He's been feeding them false information, stoking the fires of rebellion while ensuring they never actually succeed. He's playing the same game Rourke was." Zeke's pulse quickened. "If we can expose Delan, we can end this war." Kara's face hardened. "Exactly. But it's not going to be easy. Delan's paranoid, and he's watching us. We need to act fast before he catches wind of what we're doing." Zeke's mind whirled with possibilities and dangers. This was bigger than anything he'd ever been a part of. If they succeeded, they could bring down not just Delan, but the entire corrupt system that had been choking Skyhold for years. But if they failed... He looked at Kara, searching her eyes for any sign of doubt. But all he saw was determination. "We'll need help," Zeke said finally. "We can't do this alone."
Kara nodded. "I know just the people, but we have to move now."
Chapter 11, The Trap. The plan was set in motion within hours. Zeke and Kara gathered a small group of trusted allies, former rebels, rogue Concord soldiers, and a handful of civilians who had grown tired of living under constant surveillance and oppression. Together, they formed a ragtag team with one goal: to take down Dylan and expose his manipulation of both the rebellion and Concord. They would strike at the heart of Concord's operations in Skyhold, using the information Kara had gathered to infiltrate the command center and broadcast the truth to the entire city. It was a risky plan, but it was their only shot. As they moved through the dark streets of Skyhold, Zeke couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The city seemed quieter than usual, the usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. Every shadow felt like a potential threat, every sound like the approach of an unseen enemy. When they reached the command center, Zeke's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment everything would change. He exchanged a glance with Kara, who gave him a nod of reassurance, but something in her eyes made him pause. Before he could question it, a voice crackled over his comm. "Zeke Vale!" Delan's voice rang out, cold and mocking. "Did you really think I wouldn't see this coming?"
Zeke's blood turned to ice. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he realized they had walked into a trap. "Kara!" he whispered, his voice tight with panic. But Kara didn't answer. She stood frozen, her face unreadable. And then the truth hit Zeke like a sledgehammer. Kara had led him here. She had played him from the start. Chapter 12. The Final Betrayal. Zeke's breath caught in his throat as he stared at Kara, the weight of her silence crushing him. "You knew," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling comm. "You knew all along." Kara's eyes flickered with something, regret, hesitation, or maybe just cold calculation, but she didn't move. "It's not what you think, Zeke," she said, her voice low. "I had no choice." Zeke felt his world crumble. "No choice." His voice rose in disbelief. "You led us here. You killed Rourke. You said we were going to take down Delan, but you were working with him the whole time." Kara took a step toward him, her expression hardening. "I did what I had to do to survive. You don't understand what's at stake, Zeke. Dylan isn't just some corrupt commander. He's part of something bigger, something that can't be stopped." Zeke's mind reeled. "So you sold us out? You sold me out?" "I didn't sell you out," Kara snapped, her voice sharp with frustration. "I saved you. If we had gone through with the plan, we would have all been killed. Dylan was always one step ahead of us. He was watching us, waiting for us to make a move. I had to make a deal to protect you, to protect all of us." Zeke shook his head, his hands trembling with rage and betrayal. "You're lying. This was never about protecting us. This was about power." Kara's face twisted with anger. "You think you're so righteous, Zeke. You think you're better than me because you hesitated, because you couldn't pull the trigger on Rourke. I made the hard choices because someone had to. You were too busy playing hero to see the bigger picture." Zeke's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had trusted Kara. He had believed in her. And now she had shattered that trust into a million pieces.
Before he could respond, Delan's voice crackled over the comm again. "Enough of this. It's time to end the charade." Suddenly, the doors to the command center slammed shut, and armed soldiers emerged from the shadows, surrounding Zeke and the rest of the team. Zeke's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but he knew it was too late. They were trapped. Delan had been watching them from the start, and now he had them exactly where he wanted them. Kara stepped forward, her eyes cold and calculating. "I'm sorry, Zeke," she said quietly, "but this is how it has to be." Zeke stared at her, his heart breaking with every word. "You were my friend," he whispered. Kara's expression softened for a moment, and for the briefest of seconds, Zeke thought he saw a flicker of the woman he had once known. But then her face hardened again, and she turned away. "Take him," she ordered the soldiers. Zeke felt the cold barrel of a rifle press against his back as he was shoved forward, his mind spinning with disbelief. Kara had betrayed him, sold him out to Delan, and now everything they had fought for was crumbling around him. But as they led him away, one thought burned in his mind. This wasn't over yet. Chapter 13. Dark Corners. Zeke felt the cold metal of the cuffs bite into his wrists as he was led through the shadowy corridors of the command center. The soldiers flanking him said nothing, their expressions hidden behind reflective visors, but the oppressive silence felt like a death sentence. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. Kara's betrayal, Delan's trap, the pieces of the puzzle that had fallen apart right in front of him. He had thought Kara was his ally, maybe even more than that. They had been through hell together. But now she was the face of his betrayal, the person who had shattered the delicate trust they'd built over years. As they approached a set of reinforced steel doors, Zeke felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him, but as much as he wanted to give in to despair, a flicker of determination sparked deep inside. He wasn't done yet. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a small, dimly lit interrogation room. The walls were lined with sleek monitors, flickering with surveillance footage of Skyhold. In the center of the room stood a single chair, cold and menacing in the stark light. Zeke was shoved roughly into it, and his hands were chained to the armrests. As he sat there, the silence in the room became suffocating. But then the door opened, and a figure stepped inside. Delan. His presence was as cold as ever, his eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. He walked slowly around Zeke, as if savoring his victory, before finally coming to a stop in front of him. "Zeke Vale," Delan said, his voice a calm, measured drawl. "I have to admit I'm impressed. I didn't expect you to come this far."
Zeke glared up at him. "Cut the crap, Delan. What do you want?" Delan chuckled softly. "You're in no position to make demands, Lieutenant. But if it's clarity you seek, I can offer you that."
He stepped closer, leaning in slightly. "You see, Skyhold was never about control. It was about chaos, the rebellion, the insurgency. It was all engineered to keep people like you fighting each other while Concord remains in control. I've been playing both sides for years, and now, with Rourke out of the way, everything's fallen neatly into place."
Zeke's fists clenched against the restraints. "You think you've won? People are going to find out the truth. Someone will expose you."
Delan smiled coldly. "You give people too much credit, Zeke. They don't want the truth. They want stability, and I provide that. But don't worry, I'm not here to gloat. I'm here to offer you a choice." Zeke narrowed his eyes. "What kind of choice?" Delan straightened, his hands clasped behind his back. "You're a smart man, a capable soldier. Concord could use someone like you, someone who knows the city, who understands its people. If you join me, I can guarantee your safety. You could rise through the ranks, become part of the new order we're building." Zeke's heart pounded. The offer was tempting, but it was a poison pill. Dylan wasn't just offering power, he was offering corruption, a place in a system that thrived on deceit and manipulation. "I'd rather die than join you," Zeke spat, his voice seething with defiance. Dylan's expression darkened, but he remained calm. "That's unfortunate, but predictable." He turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, he paused. "Oh, and one more thing. Kara, she made her choice. She chose the winning side. You should think long and hard about whether you want to be on the losing one."
The door slid shut behind him, leaving Zeke alone in the cold, dim light.
Chapter 14. The Bargain. Zeke sat in the darkness of his cell, replaying the last few hours over and over in his head. His thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and regret. Kara had sold him out. Dylan had won. But something didn't add up. Why would Kara lead him to a trap after everything they'd been through? She wasn't heartless, cold and pragmatic maybe, but not entirely without conscience. He clenched his fists, thinking of the moment when Kara had shot Rourke. It hadn't felt right. It had been too clean, too calculated. There had to be more to the story. She wasn't just another pawn in Delan's game. Before Zeke could piece together his thoughts, the door to his cell slid open. He looked up, expecting more guards, but instead, Kara stepped inside. Her face was drawn, her eyes weary. She stood silently for a moment, just looking at him, before finally speaking. "You need to listen to me, Zeke," she said softly. Zeke's blood boiled at the sight of her. "You betrayed me." Kara flinched, but didn't look away. "I did what I had to do to keep you alive." "Alive?" Zeke spat. "You handed me over to Delan. You played me this whole time."
Kara's jaw tightened. "You think I wanted this? You think I didn't try to find another way? Delan had us under surveillance for weeks. He knew everything. If I hadn't led you into that trap, he would have killed both of us. I didn't have a choice." Zeke glared at her, his chest heaving with frustration. "So now you're working for him? You're just another one of his pawns?"
Kara's eyes flashed with anger. "I'm not a pawn, Zeke. I'm trying to survive, just like you. But we don't have time for this." She stepped closer, her voice lowering. "I've got a plan, a way to take Delan down from the inside." Zeke's eyes narrowed. "Why should I trust you?" Kara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Because I'm risking everything. If Delan finds out what I'm doing, I'm dead. But I need your help, Zeke. We can still win this." Zeke studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. There was something different in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Fear, maybe, or desperation.
"What's the plan?" Zeke asked cautiously.
Kara glanced toward the door, as if expecting someone to barge in at any moment. "There's a shipment of weapons coming into Skyhold tonight, high-grade tech, powerful enough to level half the city. Delan's going to use it to crush the rebellion once and for all. But if we can intercept it, we can turn it against him." Zeke's heart pounded. "And how do you plan to pull that off?" Kara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Delan trusts me. He doesn't suspect I'm working against him yet. I can get us access to the shipment, but we'll need to move fast. If we don't stop him now, he'll destroy everything. Zeke sat in silence for a moment, weighing his options. He didn't fully trust Kara, but the stakes were too high to ignore. Delan was poised to wipe out the rebellion, and if Kara was telling the truth, this could be their only chance to stop him. "All right," Zeke said finally. "I'll help you. But if you cross me again—" "I won't," Kara interrupted, her voice steady. "This time we're in this together." Zeke nodded, though doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. Kara had betrayed him once, and there was no guarantee she wouldn't do it again. But for now, they had a common enemy, and that would have to be enough. Chapter 15. The Heist. Nightfall blanketed Skyhold as Zeke and Kara moved through the city's industrial district, their steps quick and silent. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them like a heavy cloak. The plan was simple: infiltrate the weapons shipment, disable the guards, and steal the tech before Delan's forces could deploy it. But Zeke knew nothing was ever that simple. Dylan would have contingencies, traps waiting for anyone foolish enough to cross him. One wrong move, and they'd be dead. As they approached the warehouse where the shipment was being stored, Zeke glanced at Kara. She moved with the same confident precision he had always admired, but now there was a nervous edge to her movements, a hint of vulnerability she had never shown before. "This is it," she whispered, stopping just outside the entrance. "Once we're in, there's no turning back." Zeke nodded, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. "Let's do this." They slipped inside the warehouse, the dim light casting long shadows over the rows of crates and equipment. The guards were sparse, just as Kara had predicted, but Zeke knew that Delan's real forces were likely stationed nearby, waiting for any sign of trouble. Kara led the way, her movements quick and efficient, as she disabled the security systems and unlocked the door to the storage room where the shipment was being held. Inside, rows of high-tech weapons gleamed in the dim light, their sleek designs a stark contrast to the grimy industrial surroundings. "We need to move fast," Kara said, pulling a small device from her belt and attaching it to one of the crates. "This will trigger a feedback loop in Delan's comms network. It'll give us a few minutes of radio silence before they realize what's happening." Zeke nodded, keeping his eyes on the entrance. "How do we get this stuff out of here?" "There's a transport vehicle waiting on the other side of the building," Kara replied. "We just need to—"
Suddenly, the door to the storage room burst open and a squad of armed soldiers stormed in, their weapons trained on Zeke and Kara. At the head of the group was Delan, his face twisted into a triumphant sneer.
"I knew you couldn't resist, Kara," Delan said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" Kara's face hardened, but Zeke could see the fear in her eyes. "Delan!" "Save it!" Delan snapped, stepping forward. "I gave you a chance, Kara. I offered you power, security, a place in the new order, and this is how you repay me?" Zeke's hand hovered over his weapon, but he knew it was futile. They were surrounded, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. But then something unexpected happened. Kara stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I never wanted your power, Delan. I wanted to stop you." Delan's smile faltered, and for a moment uncertainty flickered across his face. But before he could react, Kara lunged at him, her hand closing around the handle of a knife she had concealed in her belt. There was a brief, violent struggle as Kara and Delan fought for control of the weapon. Chapter 16. Shadows and Sacrifice. Zeke's world slowed to a crawl. He watched Kara lunge at Delan, their bodies colliding in a blur of violence. Soldiers raised their weapons but hesitated, unsure of what to do, as their leader was embroiled in a close-quarters struggle. Zeke's instincts screamed at him to move. Without thinking, he dove behind a crate, pulling his pistol free and firing at the soldiers. Shots ricocheted off the metal walls, sending sparks flying as chaos erupted. Kara and Delan crashed to the ground, the knife glinting in the dim light as they grappled for control. Delan's strength was surprising, and his face twisted in rage as he fought to overpower Kara. But Kara wasn't weak. Her muscles tensed as she twisted her body, using her momentum to knock Delan off balance. The knife slipped from his hand, clattering across the floor. "Zeke!" Kara shouted through gritted teeth, still locked in combat. Zeke scrambled from behind the crate, dodging incoming fire as he made his way toward her. He slid across the floor, grabbing the knife just as Delan's hand reached for it. With a surge of adrenaline, Zeke stabbed the blade into the ground, driving it into Delan's wrist, pinning him down. Delan let out a strangled cry of pain, his grip faltering. But the momentary victory was short-lived. The soldiers, recovering from their confusion, trained their rifles on Zeke and Kara. They were surrounded, and there was no way out. "Drop the weapon!" one of the soldiers barked, his voice cold and mechanical through his helmet. Zeke's heart pounded as he looked at Kara. Her eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. They were out of options. But before either of them could move, a deafening explosion rocked the warehouse. The walls trembled, and the ceiling groaned as debris rained down from above. Zeke shielded his face as a cloud of dust and smoke filled the room, obscuring everything. Through the chaos, Zeke heard the sounds of combat outside, gunfire, shouting, and the unmistakable roar of a transport vehicle's engine. The rebellion had arrived. Kara seized the moment of confusion, elbowing Delan in the face before leaping to her feet. Zeke followed, pulling the knife free from the ground. They sprinted toward the nearest exit as the soldiers were caught off guard by the sudden assault from outside. They burst through the door into the open air, the night sky lit up by muzzle flashes and explosions. Rebel forces were engaging Delan's troops in a fierce battle, the sound of gunfire echoing across the industrial district. Smoke billowed from the transport vehicles that had been parked outside the warehouse, and the heavy thud of mortars shook the ground. Zeke and Kara ducked behind a burning vehicle, catching their breath. "Did you know the rebels were coming?" Zeke asked, his voice breathless.
Kara shook her head, wiping the sweat and grime from her brow. "No, this wasn't part of the plan." Zeke glanced around, trying to get a sense of the battlefield. The rebels had caught Delan's forces off guard, but the commander's soldiers were regrouping quickly. They wouldn't hold for long. In the distance, Zeke spotted a familiar figure, tall and imposing, directing the rebel attack. It was Arden, their old ally. The one Zeke had feared was lost to Delan's influence. It seemed Arden hadn't turned after all. "Kara, we need to get to Arden," Zeke said, pointing toward the distant figure. "He can help us get out of here." Kara nodded, but Zeke could see the doubt in her eyes. "Zeke,
She hesitated, the words sticking in her throat. Before she could finish, another explosion rocked the ground, and they were thrown off balance. "Move!" Zeke shouted, pulling her to her feet.
They weaved through the chaos, dodging gunfire and leaping over debris as they made their way toward Arden. Zeke's heart raced, not just from the danger, but from the uncertainty of what would happen next. Could they trust Arden? Could they trust anyone now?
As they reached Arden's position, the rebel leader turned, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw them approach. "Zeke! Kara!" he called out, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of battle. "What the hell are you doing here?" Zeke didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Dylan's inside. We have to stop him before he can escape."
Arden's jaw clenched, his gaze flickering to the warehouse behind them. He's not getting away this time. But just as Arden gave the order to advance on the warehouse, a squad of Dellen's elite soldiers appeared from the shadows, cutting off their path. They were heavily armored and armed with advanced weaponry, their presence sending a chill down Zeke's spine. "We can't fight them head-on," Kara muttered, her eyes scanning the area for cover. Zeke's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but before he could speak, one of the elite soldiers stepped forward. He removed his helmet, revealing a familiar face. It was Keenan, one of Zeke's closest friends from their early days in the rebellion. Zeke's heart sank. "Keenan!" Keenan's expression was cold, devoid of the warmth Zeke remembered. "It didn't have to be this way, Zeke. You should have joined us." Zeke took a step forward, his voice thick with disbelief. "Keenan, you were always the one who said we had to fight for something bigger than ourselves. What happened to you?" Keenan's jaw tightened. "I saw the truth, Zeke. Concord isn't the enemy. It's the only thing keeping this city from tearing itself apart. Dylan has the vision, the strength to lead. You should have listened to me." Kara tensed beside Zeke, her hand inching toward her weapon. Zeke, however, held up a hand, silently urging her to stop. This wasn't about Dylan or the rebellion anymore. This was about friendship, what was left of it. "Keenan, you know this isn't right," Zeke said, his voice steady. "Dylan doesn't care about the city. He cares about control. He's using people like you, like all of us, to feed his own ambition." Keenan's eyes flickered with something, doubt maybe. But then his face hardened again. "It's too late for that, Zeke. You made your choice. And now you have to live with the consequences." With that, Keenan raised his weapon, aiming directly at Zeke.
Time seemed to freeze as Zeke stared down the barrel of his old friend's rifle. There was a flicker of regret in Keenan's eyes, but it was buried beneath layers of loyalty to Dylan, of betrayal and twisted ideals. Zeke's hand hovered over his own gun, but he knew what pulling the trigger would mean. It would be the end of whatever bond they'd once shared, the final line crossed. "Keenan, please," Zeke said quietly, his voice strained with emotion. "You don't have to do this." For a long moment, Keenan stood there, his finger resting on the trigger. And then, in a split second, everything changed. There was a gunshot, and Zeke flinched, expecting the worst. But when he looked up, Keenan wasn't standing anymore. He had collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Kara stood beside Zeke, her pistol still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. Zeke's breath caught in his throat. His friend, his brother in arms, was dead. But there was no time to grieve. Dylan's forces were closing in, and they still had to stop him before it was too late. "Come on," Zeke said, his voice hollow. "We have to finish this." Chapter 17. Betrayal Again. Zeke, Kara, and Arden pushed forward, cutting through Dylan's remaining forces with brutal efficiency. Every step toward the warehouse was a reminder of how far they had fallen, how much had been sacrificed. Friends had become enemies, betrayal had become the currency of survival. But none of it mattered now. Not after Keenan. Not after everything.
As they reached the warehouse, Zeke spotted Dylan slipping into an armored vehicle, trying to escape amidst the chaos. With a burst of adrenaline, he sprinted forward, leaping onto the side of the vehicle just as it roared to life. Kara and Arden followed, but Zeke knew this was his fight now. He had to finish this. The vehicle careened through the streets, swerving around debris as Dylan tried to shake Zeke off. But Zeke held on, pulling himself onto the roof. He smashed the window with the butt of his pistol and pointed it at Dylan's head. "Stop!" Zeke shouted, his voice raw with anger and desperation.
Dylan sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "You think this will change anything? Skyhold is mine, Zeke. It always was." Zeke's grip on the gun tightened, his finger trembling on the trigger. He wanted to end it, to rid the world of Dylan's poison, once and for all. But then something stopped him. A memory. Chapter 18. A moment of clarity. Zeke's finger hovered over the trigger, his breath ragged as he stared into Dylan's defiant eyes. The temptation to pull the trigger burned through his veins like wildfire. After everything Dylan had done, the betrayal, the manipulation, the deaths of friends, Zeke had every reason to end it here, to finally bring justice to Skyhold by taking out the man who had corrupted everything they once stood for. But then, as he pressed the barrel harder against Dylan's temple, a memory flickered in his mind. It was the night before the rebellion had fully ignited. Zeke, Kara, and Keenan sat around a fire in one of the safe houses. They were laughing, drunk on both cheap alcohol and the dreams of a better future. Keenan had spoken of hope, Kara of survival, and Zeke of justice. They had made a pact that night, promising each other that no matter what happened, they would never lose sight of their cause, to protect the innocent, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. What would Keenan think now, the friend who had bled for that cause, who had lost himself to Dylan's false promises, and Kara, who had stood by his side through it all? What would she say if he killed Dylan in cold blood, right here, right now? Zeke took a slow breath, lowering his gun. His hand trembled, the weight of everything he'd been through crashing over him. Killing Dylan would make him no better than the man he despised. Justice didn't come from vengeance.
Dylan, realizing Zeke's hesitation, smirked, his bravado returning. "You're weak, Zeke. You don't have it in you to do what's necessary. That's why you'll never win."
Zeke clenched his teeth. "This isn't about winning." Before Dylan could react, Zeke grabbed him by the collar and yanked him out of the vehicle. They tumbled to the ground, the roar of the engine fading as the vehicle careened off into the distance, crashing into a pile of debris. Zeke hauled Dylan to his feet, holding him in a chokehold as they stood in the middle of the ruined street. "Your empire is falling apart," Zeke growled. "And you're going to answer for everything you've done." Dylan coughed, gasping for air. "You're a fool. The people don't want freedom. They want order. They want someone to tell them what to do, to protect them from themselves, and that's what I give them." "Order through fear," Zeke snapped. "Through lies and manipulation. You don't protect anyone. You use them."
But before Dylan could respond, the air was pierced by the screeching sound of hovercraft engines. Zeke looked up and saw a fleet of Concord ships descending, their lights cutting through the night sky. The backup had arrived, and it was coming for them both. "Zeke!" Kara's voice rang out as she and Arden rushed toward him. "We need to move! Now!"
Zeke shoved Dylan toward them, locking his hands behind his back with the same cuffs that had once held him. "We're not letting him escape. He's coming with us." Arden hesitated, his eyes darting between Delen and the approaching Concord ships. "He'll slow us down. We can't afford to be captured." Kara nodded. "Zeke, I hate to say it, but Arden's right. If Concord gets a hold of us now, we're finished. The rebellion is finished."
Zeke looked down at Delen, bloodied and beaten, yet still managing a sneer even in his defeat. For a brief moment, Zeke was torn. He could end it all by leaving Delan behind, letting Concord deal with him. But something deep inside him, the part of him that still clung to the ideals of justice, of doing what was right, refused to take the easy way out. "No," Zeke said firmly. "He faces justice, but on our terms."
Kara's eyes met his, filled with both frustration and understanding. "Then let's move." They raced through the streets, weaving through alleyways and abandoned buildings as the hovercraft circled above like vultures. Delan stumbled behind them, forced to keep pace with his captors, though his arrogance never seemed to falter. They eventually reached the underground tunnels that led to the heart of the rebellion's hidden base. Zeke's heart pounded as they descended into the darkness, the sounds of the battle above fading with every step. As they entered the safe zone, the weight of the last few days finally crashed down on Zeke. He had lost friends, been betrayed, and nearly given up on everything he believed in. But now, as they approached the rebel command center, there was a glimmer of hope. Delan was in custody. The city still stood. They weren't out of the fight yet. Chapter 19. The Real Enemy. Inside the command center, rebel leaders gathered around a central table, the tension in the air thick enough to cut through. Zeke stood by as Delen was locked in a high-security holding cell, his eyes flicking from the grim faces around him to the man who had caused so much pain. Arden crossed his arms, his face set in a hard line. "We've got him, but Concord knows we're here. They'll send everything they've got to wipe us out." Kara nodded, pacing the room. Delan's forces are fractured, but Concord's grip on the city is still strong. We can't hold them off forever. Zeke stared at Delen through the glass wall of the holding cell. The man sat there, utterly calm, as if none of this concerned him. It made Zeke's blood boil, but he kept his emotions in check. They had bigger problems now. "We need to use him," Zeke said, his voice steady. "Delan's the key to destabilizing Concord's hold. He knows their inner workings, their weaknesses. If we can make him talk, we can turn the tide." Arden frowned. "And what makes you think he'll cooperate?" Zeke's gaze hardened. "He's a survivor. He'll do whatever it takes to save his own skin." Kara stopped pacing and turned to face Zeke. "But can we trust anything he says? He's lied to all of us." Zeke shook his head. "We don't need to trust him. We just need to make sure that whatever information he gives us, we verify it ourselves. He'll try to manipulate us, but we'll stay one step ahead." The room fell into silence as the gravity of the situation settled in. The rebellion was on the brink of collapse, and their only chance of survival was to outthink and outmaneuver a man who had been playing this game far longer than any of them. Suddenly a loud crash echoed from the holding cell. Everyone turned in alarm as the glass wall shattered and Delan burst free, his hands no longer bound. The soldiers guarding him lay unconscious on the floor. "Damn it!" Arden cursed, drawing his weapon. "How did he—" But before anyone could react, Delan was gone, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. Chaos erupted in the command center as alarms blared and soldiers scrambled to contain the breach. Zeke's heart pounded in his chest. Delan had escaped. Again. "We have to find him," Kara shouted, already running toward the exit.
But Zeke knew deep down that Delan was already gone. The real fight wasn't just about chasing one man, it was about dismantling the system that had allowed Delan to thrive, the system that had turned friends into enemies and corrupted everything they once stood for. And as Zeke stood in the heart of the rebellion's crumbling base, he realized something else. The battle for Skyhold was far from over.
Chapter 20. The Price of Survival. Days passed after Delan's escape, and the rebellion was forced underground, deeper than ever before. Concord had ramped up its efforts to crush them, deploying drones and soldiers to every corner of the city, rooting out anyone even suspected of aiding the insurgents. The people of Skyhold lived in fear, and the once glimmering hope of freedom had been all but extinguished. But Zeke refused to give up. Even as they moved through the deepest tunnels planning their next move, he knew that Delan's time was running out. Every empire fell eventually, and Zeke was determined to be there when Delan's crumbled. Kara had grown quieter, more distant since that night. Zeke knew she blamed herself for Delan's escape, but he didn't hold it against her. They had all underestimated him. The man was slippery, always 2 steps ahead. Still, Zeke couldn't shake the feeling that Delan's escape hadn't been entirely unexpected. There had been no sign of a forced break, no alarms tripped before the glass shattered. Someone had let him out, someone inside the rebellion. "Trust no one," Zeke whispered to himself, staring out at the darkened tunnels. Suddenly a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Zeke." He turned to see Kara standing there, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "We need to talk." Zeke nodded, sensing the weight in her voice. They walked to a quieter corner of the base, away from the constant buzz of activity. "What is it?" he asked, already bracing for the worst. Kara hesitated, then finally spoke. "I've been doing some digging." Chapter 21. The Fall of Arden. Weeks passed in tense silence as Zeke and Kara worked in secret, gathering evidence against Arden. It wasn't easy. Arden was careful, covering his tracks and maintaining his loyalist image. But slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. Conversations intercepted, suspicious orders, and finally, a payment made from a Concord account directly to Arden's name. When Zeke finally had enough proof, they acted swiftly. One night, while the rest of the rebellion gathered in their underground base, Zeke and Kara stepped forward. They confronted Arden in front of the entire leadership council, laying out the evidence for all to see. At first, Arden denied everything, his face a mask of cold confidence, but as the truth became undeniable, the crowd turned against him. Arden's eyes flickered with desperation as he realized the noose was tightening. "You don't understand," he hissed, his voice low. "This was the only way to save us. Concord would have crushed us without my connections. I did what I had to do." Zeke stepped forward, his voice steady. "You betrayed everything we stood for. You turned your back on the very people you swore to protect." Arden's face twisted with fury, but he was out of options. The rebellion had seen the truth, and now they were calling for his removal. In a final act of defiance, Arden drew his weapon, aiming it directly at Zeke. But before he could fire, a shot rang out. Kara stood behind him, her pistol smoking as Arden collapsed to the ground. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, slowly, the rebels began to realize what had just happened. The rebellion wasn't dead. It had been saved. Epilogue. Hope amidst the ashes. Months later, Zeke stood atop one of the old skyscrapers, staring out over the city. Skyhold was still scarred, its streets lined with the wreckage of battles fought and lives lost. But amidst the ruins, there was something new, a glimmer of hope. The rebellion had regrouped, stronger than ever. Arden's betrayal had shaken them, but it had also united them in a way Zeke had never thought possible. With Delan gone and Concord's grip weakening, the people of Skyhold were beginning to rise up, reclaiming their city, their future. Kara approached, standing beside Zeke as they watched the sunrise. "It's not over yet," she said softly. Zeke nodded. "No, but we're closer than we've ever been."
They stood in silence for a long time, watching as the city below began to stir, its people waking to a new day. A day without Delan, without Arden. A day where they could finally begin to rebuild.
Zeke took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the sun wash over him. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they had a chance. And for now, that was enough. Thank you for listening to this recording of Splinter by J.S. Miller, read by Adam Slate.